Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, April 29th, 2020, getting towards the end of April. And it does seem like it kind of went by in a flash after the longest March in history. Very strange. But, okay, I guess maybe that means we're getting ready, or getting used to things here. It certainly doesn't mean we're getting any readier for another broadcast. But time has arrived regardless, and it's time to move forward. Today, let's see, I don't know if anyone's noticed the pandemic we're in the middle of, but in pandemic news, I guess we're getting set for the count of our 60,000th officially acknowledged death due to the coronavirus infection here in the United States. That, of course, brings us up to the number that the administration until recently had pegged as our total that they were hoping for anyway. By August, we will, of course, exit April by bypassing that, and by a decent number, too. Of course, we're running at about 2,000 to 2,500 lost a day, at least officially acknowledged. That doesn't include those who are dying untested or outside of hospitals or at home or anywhere else for that matter. And I've got some questions today raised by an interesting article forwarded to me by my wife from Scientific American's blogs. Anyway, I suppose that leaves us some room for question about whether or not this is a verified and universally accepted scientific conclusion. But we did some checking behind it, and we'll talk with Greg about it. And it turns out that the flu numbers that a lot of the denialists in particular have been relying on in order to compare the COVID-19 pandemic to the flu. And it's no worse than the flu. Of course, we've actually surpassed the numbers that they were relying on and done so very, very quickly, which really illustrates the difference between the two illnesses all by itself. But as it turns out, they've been projecting, maybe knowingly, maybe unknowingly, projecting all of the faults of the flu numbers onto the COVID-19 numbers. They insist that they're inflated. They insist that there's some sort of estimate. I think one of the more popular tropes among the right-wing denialists and those who would push back on these things is that New York is giving fake numbers, or that they're simply counting everybody who died during this time period as a COVID-19 death, neither of which are demonstrably true. And as it turns out, the flu numbers, and in particular the ones cited by Donald Trump in comparing things in the early days anyway, to the flu, turn out to be estimates themselves, algorithmic estimates at that, and those are usually things that conservatives complain and stomp their feet about when it's, say, attached to how we complete the census or things like that. But no, as it turns out, according to this assertion in the blog entry anyway, the COVID-19 numbers are actual counts, how many people are coming in, exhibiting these symptoms, and then dying, at least in the hospital. And in the early going, anyway, they were also testing to make sure that they were counting things correctly. And then, of course, they ran into the roadblock of not having enough tests to go around for living people, and simply saying, well, all the complications here, it's pretty obvious what we're talking about. We're going to put that down as exactly what it should be. Whereas with the flu, well, we'll go over the article perhaps, but there, very few of the deaths usually attributed to what we refer to as CDC's numbers on flu mortality are actually deaths attributed to the flu. And some of that is a mistake, perhaps, in the methodologies. And, it just doesn't make any sense, typically speaking, to count the number of people who are dying in a typical flu season, probably of flu or flu-related complications, because it's usually not a big problem. But, the number of people who have influenza on their death certificates is, well, compared to COVID-19 now, next to nothing. Well, we'll see if we can't figure out whether that holds true in Greg's mind, and see what else he has gathered for us to share on this Wednesday. We have lots of other stories circulating. Mike Pence, of course, making an ass of himself, showing up at the Mayo Clinic yesterday and refusing to wear a mask. And if you thought that wasn't, assy enough, I guess, apparently his excuse for not wearing a mask is that it makes it difficult to do this thing that he thinks of as a very responsible politician type of thing to do. You can't look people in the eye and get a genuine assessment of where they are personally, morally, politically, whatever it is he's trying to judge by if you're wearing a mask, which it doesn't make any sense. I mean, unless he's been wearing the masks wrong the whole time, and that's a possibility. We are in the middle of a pandemic that it would be, I think, a lot easier to cut down on the transmission numbers if people wore the masks correctly. But I've seen a lot of mistakes out there, but none where they were wearing them over the eyes. That's a new one on me. And I guess what he sort of meant, there is something to be said for the rest of the face being open for inspection. You can certainly learn a lot more about what's being conveyed if you can speak face to face and see people's expressions. That's true. But of course, if you're in a clinical setting where there are vulnerable patients, and as we learned from reading the New Yorker piece over the last couple of days, the importance of signaling that mask wearing is important and serious by the leaders in the country is a serious thing. Trump, of course, having abdicated that. Lots of theories as to why Pence would refuse to wear it, and some of them probably have to do with covering the face. They clearly, in the Trump White House, feel that they look silly with masks on. They don't look presidential or leader-like in some way. I'm sure in Trump's fevered mind, and probably really is fevered, and they really ought to get him out of there, he thinks that masks signal weakness, which is, of course, a huge misunderstanding of what the masks are supposed to be about, which at this date in the outbreak is really super serious in terms of his ability to lead our way out of this thing. But he clearly thinks of masks as signals that you're afraid of the virus and that you are hoping that the mask will protect you and you need protection because you're weak, whereas the actual reason for wearing the masks is to protect the others, particularly in that clinical setting. But okay, whatever. We'll catch up with it and hear some more opinion about it, no doubt. Let's see, other headlines made yesterday. Trump purportedly to issue an executive order, and I guess it's been issued now. It just turns out to be not what everybody said. But the big splash was that he was going to forestall the projected meat shortages in the country by issuing an executive order forcing the meatpacking plants to stay open. All right, it's a little bit of a delay in answering the phone on Greg here as my main computer hid the Skype from us, but it is there and it is working. Good morning, Greg. I was just telling everybody about the executive order that may or may not actually reopen meat plants. We'll examine that perhaps later on as well.
Oh, okay. Is he using the Defense Protection Act to force people to not sue?
Well, he thinks he is, and there are one or two analyses of the actual content of the order which are out, which once again basically demonstrates, don't listen to what he says his executive orders are going to do. Wait for them, make sure he signs them, and we really haven't seen whether he did or not, and then read them.
You know, you've brought up in just the past few minutes like 5 different ways we can go here. We do want to talk about flu and what the numbers are. We do want to talk about whether or not you should believe anything he says, but at the same time, should you see him live and talk about that? There's a good piece by Olivia Nuzzi on that right now, as a matter of fact, and she has good reason to ask that question because she was the one who asked the question at the briefing as to whether or not he felt bad that more people have died from the coronavirus than Vietnam. And she weighs in on the should we do it live or should we not do it live. And then we have a lot to, if you excuse the expression, unpack in the meat story there about what's going on with corrupt people like the Batista brothers and JBS and Tyson and Smithfield and all that stuff, and why we're at risk of actually putting the food supply under the gun there. So let's talk about flu first.
All right. We can do that.
Because it does come up, stupid things come up.
Sure.
This is just like a car accident. I take a risk of driving every time I get in the car, but I get in the car anyway. You can't stop me. Freedom.
Yes.
So let's go back to basics here.
All right.
CDC publishes at their website an explanatory, Voxplainer, except not nearly as good because it's tough to read, piece about what they call the burden of influenza. And this is something that we've talked about on the show before.
Yes, we bear that burden.
During a typical flu season, there's so many people with flu that you don't, as a clinician, test everybody. You can't. You don't have enough kits. Sound familiar? So what happens is, at the very beginning of a flu season, which we know is coming, September, October, and then we start gearing up the vaccinations, and then certainly around November, but in some years later, people start showing up with fever and cough, and we call that influenza-like illness, or ILI.
Right.
And in order to get an idea as to whether or not this is starting to break out in the country, several different things are done simultaneously. Clinicians at what they call sentinel sites will send the test swabs to either their state Department of Public Health or CDC eventually, and those results get collated weekly. So we see how many cases of flu are in the country and are they rising at these sentinel sites. And by the way, if you do have flu, what kind of flu is it? Is it flu A? Is it influenza B? Is it H1N1? Does it match the vaccine? And so all of that is going on. At the same time, the emergency departments are measuring how many people come in with the complaint of cough and fever, and so we call that influenza-like illness, or ILI, and that's a separate measure called syndromic surveillance. And that's what we used in New York City, for example, to figure out that something really unusual is going on, because all of a sudden there are people showing up with influenza-like illness at a time where you'd figure that the flu season is already winding down.
Yes.
What's up with that? And as a matter of fact, as we speak, and you can, Scott Anderson also can put this on later in the roundup, but I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like by age group in the New York City emergency surveillance network.
I can see it.
And what you can see is that the visit rates in, let's just pick the 45 to 64 age group right in the middle of the chart there.
Okay.
By March 1st was pretty flat, and then all of a sudden started to rise in April.
Yeah, I see.
And flu season's over. Why is that going up?
They have some sort of flu-like thing.
That's because of Rona. So what happened is it was picked up that, hey, something unusual is going on. So that influenza-like illness is a separate monitoring system to the sentinel sites that pick up individual cases of flu. So all the clinicians look at that and say, look, I know what happens every year. I see it every year. If you see one flu season, you've seen one flu season. But we kind of get an idea of what's going on. I know what time of year to look for it. And all these people are coming in with cough and fever. It must be flu because it's October.
Yeah.
And I'll test. I see this going on in the country. I see that this area over here has a documented increase in flu cases. I see that emergency room over there has an increase in influenza-like illness. I'm starting to see it in my practice. I'll do some tests here. I got some swabs. I'll send it to the lab. Oh, some of these people actually have something different, but some of these people are starting to have flu. And then next week, all of the ones I thought had flu have flu. And once I see that, I stop testing. You look like you have the flu. You have the flu. Good enough.
Yeah.
Treat it accordingly. And that's what typically happens from year to year. Now, you can't take I stopped testing. I don't have enough tests. You have the flu, and translate that into, well, how many people actually had the flu? You can't, because it's not specific recorded data. So what the CDC does is model it. And they take this model based on the above, and they figure out that, okay, based on what we're seeing here, this number of people have flu. And based on what we're seeing here in a typical year, let's say from 2010 till now, somewhere between 20 and 60,000 people a year die from influenza.
Yeah.
Some years are worse, some years are better, some years the vaccine matches, some years it doesn't. There might be a twist. It might be an H3N2 and not an H1N1. This year might be more flu B and less flu A. We might get a few mild seasons. We might get a bad one. And so from year to year, it changes. But on average, that's about what we're seeing. And that's where the how many people die of flu number comes from. For conservative pontificators to suddenly discover that it isn't a real number is stupid.
Well, I don't think that they have discovered that. I think what they've discovered, what they're pinning their hopes to, is that it is a real count, and the COVID number isn't, and that's the one that they're really estimating. And these are hard numbers, and therefore,
but they're not really hard numbers in the following sense. And I'm not even getting to COVID yet. I'm talking about flu.
Yes, well, they're not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like I said, if you've seen one flu season, you've seen one flu season. We have had flu pandemics before,
right?
1968 and 2009. And I sent you a really interesting piece called Visualizing the History of Pandemics.
I can see it.
From Antonine Plague to the novel coronavirus.
Yeah. Okay.
And the point that makes is that even if you just look at the part of the picture that's more toward, modern times rather than ancient times, or medieval times. Yeah. There were different flus at different times that did different things. For example, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918-1919 in this particular graphic is estimated at 50 million deaths.
Yes.
Okay?
I see.
And it could be more. People don't really know because, like now, every death wasn't recorded.
Right. Okay.
But 50 million, Spanish flu. Or 1918 flu, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, there's a Russian flu that happened before then, 1889, 1890. That was about 1 million. And the Asian flu in 57, 58 was 1 million. Hong Kong flu in 68 to 70. And notice these are over a period of years, not just 6 weeks.
See that. Yes.
Okay, and that's where it comes down to the car crashes and how you compare them. But or the Vietnam War for that matter. Right. Hong Kong flu, 1 million. Asian flu, 1 million. Deaths. Swine flu, 200,000. And right now, COVID-19 estimated, ongoing, at 212,000. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the point is, when you say, well, it's just like flu, the obvious answer is, which flu?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Are you talking about Spanish flu? It's just like that? That's the case you're making? Yeah. Or are you talking about swine flu? Right. What flu are you talking about? And swine flu, are we talking about 76 swine flu, or are we talking about 2009 swine flu? What are you saying? What point are you attempting to make? You're not even clear about what point you're attempting to make when you compare it to flu.
Yeah,
you want to compare it to flu? Compare it to 1918. That was pretty damn bad.
That was regular flu.
It's no worse than 1918 flu. Well, thank you very much.
Right. Okay.
Hey, how hot is that stuff? Well, it's no worse than sticking your head in the middle of the sun.
I mean, for all practical
fine.
purposes,
what kind of point you're trying to make? I don't know, but there you have it.
Die harder. I don't know. Yeah, well, that's a big problem, certainly. But yeah, it was interesting to find out that for all of the certainty, I mean, the real problem in my mind has been the conservative denialists insisting that it was objectively not as bad as some flu, because at one point Donald Trump said something, well, maybe up to 60,000 die every year.
So up to 60,000 die every year of regular seasonal flu on average.
Yes.
Okay. And maybe even a little less.
Maybe.
Again, the range of people dying from flu from 2010 till now, estimated by CDC, what they call the burden of influenza, okay, is 12,000 to 61,000 deaths annually. Now, 12,000, we're already worse than that.
Yes.
61,000, we'll get there pretty quick.
Yeah, like today.
Okay, that's annually. That's in a year. Yeah. We're talking about what's happened in 6 weeks. You want to annualize that to get a better idea of what's going on? You do that with the economy all the time.
Yeah, and that's true. And we're also
conservatives love the economy. Go ahead, annualize it.
I guess that's true too. We do tend to divide that up and when convenient. But yeah, I mean, I guess if all the people
numbers. So I mean, so there's that. So you have the fact that flu is actually a very big burden.
Yeah.
And even taking a typical normal seasonal flu compared to that, this is way worse. Then the final piece is, okay, well, how do you put this all in context? And the answer is another way of modeling.
Okay.
Okay? And that way of modeling is called excess deaths. You take the number of deaths that you think are going to happen based on previous years, and then you see, are we above that? And that's the XX deaths. And so the U.S. deaths from COVID-19 could be significantly higher than reported. Here's another infographic. This one is from Forbes, so conservatives should like it.
Aha.
Okay. And for example, reported COVID deaths as a share of total U.S. excess deaths just for the month of March.
March, okay.
Right? In New York State, excluding New York City, there's 1,700 excess deaths.
Excluding New York City. Okay.
Yeah. In New York City, there's 6,300. In New Jersey, 2,200. I mean, you can figure these excess deaths. You can do this for every country. Places like The Economist have done that. There was an article in the Washington Post a couple of days ago about that.
Yeah.
This is yet another different one. But anytime you start looking at excess deaths and comparing it to where we should be, you find a big spike.
Yeah.
And the reason you're finding a big spike is more people than you would have expected.
Yes, over many years of averaging.
Is occurring. Okay, and let me just give you the Washington Post article because that's pretty accessible too.
Yeah,
all of these papers are making their coronavirus articles free besides the paywall. But you could really see the U.S. excess deaths as it spikes in this particular graphic.
I mentioned it yesterday. I didn't read through it, so this is good, okay?
Right, so whether you're looking at comparing it to a flu season, once you're clear that you're talking about an average flu season and that you're talking about something that happens over the course of a year, and then go back and try to look at coronavirus and see how it compares, you'll find that coronavirus is far more deadly. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with comparing it to flu. If you want to compare it to flu, pick 1918 flu.
I guess you should.
Because that's the best comparison. And that happened over years, a couple of years, and waves. Here's another interesting thing.
True, too.
There's stuff that people, quote, know, end quote, scare quotes around know.
All right.
Right? We know that there were several waves to the 1918 flu, and that the second wave was felt to be particularly bad. Truth is, we don't really know because people weren't measuring. We didn't have the ability. We don't even have the ability now to measure every case of flu. We certainly didn't then.
Right.
But it appears that it was worse, and there's a couple of reasons for that. And probably world travel and World War I and packing all the young people who were getting it into these tightly packed troop ships. I mean, and camps. There's a number of reasons why that might have been the case. But certainly there is evidence that people that locked down and stayed down, like in Wisconsin, did better than people who loosened up too soon. So that's part of the concern. We're not even over the first wave, and people are starting to loosen up in the U.S., some in a very controlled and carefully thought out fashion, which may or may not work, like in Tennessee, where they're being guided, at least in the larger towns and cities, by Johns Hopkins advice as to how to do this, or just go ahead and open up because massage parlors are good, like they're doing in Georgia. I mean, there's sorts of, the fact that CDC is there and nobody asks them is a different story altogether.
They're right there.
There's lots of different ways to do that. And in 1918, we saw that people who opened up too soon just invited igniting, if you will, of the flu fuse. And so we're quite worried about that happening here. We're not even over the peak. We hit a plateau, as we talked about. It's a butte, B-U-T-T-E, right? I mean, it's not Pikes Peak up and down. And in fact, the downside of the curve is not the same as the upside. It doesn't go up and down. It goes up and then it slowly goes down. Think of it more like George W. Bush's approval.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So more area to shade under the curve.
Yes, it spiked up and then it took forever to go down, although it was a very good trend down, which was stable and kept going and going and going, and that was W's approval. That's, more likely what's going to happen here with individual spikes as, people open up too soon and then you get a problem here and there. Knowing that the country is a amalgam of different regional areas. So each area is going to be doing something a little bit different. And so all of these conservative comparisons to flu are stupid on the face of it, superficial, inadequate, and basically just playing with numbers to make a point where they don't even know what the point is. Because, flu? Oh, you mean 1918 flu? No, we're not saying that. Well, actually, you should be.
Why not? Yeah, that's true. And I found so many people who made the argument that it was like flu based on this idea. And I mean, I think I had the same mistaken notion. I didn't come to the same conclusion, but I had the same mistaken notion that they had some serious idea that in this year X number died, and in that year
they
Y
do.
number
A model is a serious idea.
That's true. I guess that's true. I'm being unfair about it being serious, but I thought that they were out there counting 1 flu. 2 flus, 3
red flus, and blue flus.
No,
they don't do it that way.
No, okay. So that's important to find out. And if, it should, if you're a rational person, change the nature of what it means to you when you're comparing one illness to another. And I guess we've just been given a reason.
You count all votes, but you don't count all polls. How can anybody know one person's ahead or not? They only asked 1,000 people.
Yeah. All right.
They model it.
Right. That's true. That's exactly right. And people hate that for some reason when they find out that that's the case. So the models can be perfectly accurate, perfectly helpful and useful things. But
counting everybody. So we'll get back to that after the break because we got some nice polling model to talk about.
All right. Great. See more of this modeling stuff. No one can get enough modeling. All right. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Well, we're now back into our show. Welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show. And let's see, we've been having our discussion in the background. Yeah, it occurred to me, because Greg said it to me during the break, hey, you haven't actually shown me what article you're talking about here. Ah, yes, right, that thing. And I said, I told you what was in it. What more do you need to know? But we're sharing it here. It's just by way of explaining what's going on. I think what the writer is an emergency department doc who, I guess, in thinking about the pandemic, and comparing things to flu and the cause of death, etc., has said to himself, in my emergency practice, I don't think I've ever, maybe but once or twice, put down on a death certificate as a cause of death influenza. Is this, and for something that's killing up to 60,000 people a year, don't you think I would have put that down somewhere along the line? And speaking to other docs who are not flu specialists and pulmonologists, for instance, you're probably not going to run into a whole lot of them necessarily, but he doesn't come to the conclusion that that's not happening. He's just coming to the conclusion that, well, in my practice, in my daily practice, that's not something I usually put down there. But if you look at the way things are modeled and the way things are explained, sure, oh yeah, I understand. This person definitely had the flu and it definitely complicated something for them. I usually find that other thing and put that down, but if you're on the lookout for flu, well, you will find it. It is there. It's just that most docs, I guess, don't face it day to day. But Greg does, so now we know.
Right. So I recognize the name Jeremy Faust, of course. He wrote back in March, on March 4th, COVID-19's mortality rate isn't as high as we think.
Uh-huh.
Well,
lots of people have said that.
We still don't know that, though.
Yeah.
But, he's talking about the fact that at the time the WHO was estimating, in the 4% range.
Mm-hmm.
And he's making that the true case fatality rate of SARS-CoV-2 is well under 1%, and he does that from the Diamond Princess cruise outbreak, which is a flawed way to look at it. I'm just saying a lot of the stuff he does is flawed, and he tends to underplay a lot of stuff here. We don't know those numbers yet.
My main interest in it was, look at, he's explaining how CDC comes up with its flu numbers, and then I went to the CDC site, and they said, yes, this is how we come up with our flu numbers. Okay.
I mean, to me, this reads like I'm not used to doing modeling. I just ran into this model. I don't like it, so let me explain to you why it's wrong.
Okay. To me, it was sort of like, well, like I said, the main thing I took away from it is
I don't particularly,
arguing that those are real
I just
counts.
discovered the fact that weathermen actually don't experience the weather. Like they're not getting up in helicopters, and not all of them anyway. They don't fly into the storms and they're just doing these models.
Yes.
Which I don't fully understand, but I don't like the idea of doing modeling when I can open my window and look outside.
Well, when was the last time the meteorologist told you about any meteors?
Well, I'm saying, So if I can open up the window and look outside, that to me is the gold standard. That's what he's saying here. The gold standard is what I see in my emergency room on my shift.
Yes. Gold standard.
And forget about what everybody else is experiencing. Forget about the New York City experience.
The gold standard idea, it just sparked another thought. Another thing I'm running into a lot is, I guess Trump was triumphant yesterday in pointing out that the United States has surpassed South Korea, the gold standard in testing, surpassed South Korea in per capita testing.
All of those comparisons, kind of fall short when you're trying to do that. Now, I'll tell you what Jeremy gets right, absolutely right.
Yes, his name.
And that is that this is way more lethal than a typical seasonal flu.
He does appear to...
In other words, the coronavirus is not anything like the flu. It's much, much worse. Well, he takes it from two ways. He had originally downplayed the seriousness of coronavirus, and then discovered, it is pretty serious.
Where is he?
So in the first article in March, it's it's probably not nearly that high. It's much lower than that. Well, actually, no, it's pretty high at the moment, at least is what we're seeing. And then says, but there's two reasons why this is way more than flu. Coronavirus is really bad, and flu isn't that bad.
Oh, well, okay.
Okay, so now it makes it even a bigger stretch to say the coronavirus is like flu. Well, he's right about coronavirus and probably wrong about flu. I don't think he's appreciating the flu burden. But that's, an academic discussion. That's not he's dumb or that, he's doing it wrong or anything like that. There's a lot of people that don't appreciate those models and just think that they don't reflect what they feel is the real burden of what's going on. Again, that's why we look at things like influenza-like illness.
Yeah.
And don't try to measure every single case. And that's why looking at excess deaths are so important. There's a whole lot of different ways one can model this. But people die during flu season, and they die of pneumonia, and they die of other things. And when you look at those deaths compared to, let's say, summer, you get an idea of the disease burden. And again, it's a model. There's a number of ways to do that. But downplaying how bad flu is, I don't get that. I don't understand it.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I didn't get the same feeling from it, but I was looking for something else out of the article initially. But it's good to have this warning and this context about this guy. Although he is in Boston. I don't know how you missed the
He's good. I mean, he's a smart guy. I mean, I know his name. I've seen it come up in a lot of different things. And believe me, he's following this extremely closely. And he's no dummy. And he's got a lot of good things to say. As a matter of fact, Jeff Flyer, who is the former dean of Harvard Medical School, now retired, was just making a point. I think he did an op-ed a couple of days ago, but I saw him on Twitter, and I was having this discussion with him. And it was basically saying, look, don't dump on the iconoclasts who come up with different theories about what's going on with COVID-19 in the science community. We're not talking about the nutcases. But if you have a professor or a doctor who has a different point of view, than the official CDC, line, don't immediately dismiss them and don't disparage them because they think it's worse or better or whatever. That really, not fair, not right, not fair game to attack them for that. So I'm not attacking Jeremy for that at all.
Right. Well, good.
He's entitled to his opinion, and it's an informed opinion, and he's on the front lines. He's in the emergency room in Boston.
Yeah.
So he has a pretty good feel for what's going on with both flu and with coronavirus.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think he's right about coronavirus. But the fact that, and I know those hospitals and I know Boston, and, the Brigham isn't necessarily where all your flu cases are going anyway.
That could be true. Okay. Well, I understood where he was coming from.
I used to work at that hospital.
Well, and then you had to go somewhere else to find all the flu.
Well, I'm so old.
Yeah.
That when I worked at Brigham and Women's Hospital, it was just the Peter Bent Brigham.
Okay.
And it hadn't merged with the Women's Hospital, which was next door.
But it was inevitability. It was next door. How else could they do it?
Yeah. So,
right.
these
well,
things
that makes some sense. And I thought he had some good, sensible observations to make. And the fact that, that's as good a place as any. And really, he wasn't saying nobody's dying of the flu. He was saying, my practice exists in a place where I don't typically write that down. So who's writing it down and how often?
And how are we measuring it? And I think that those are all extremely valid questions. Again, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm dumping on him.
No, I think that was a good point.
I just see all the time, and I've seen this for 20 years, 30 years, people saying, well, flu can't be as bad as they say because X, Y, or Z.
I don't get it.
And it turns out, actually it is.
Yeah. Well, that was where that was where the surprise came from for Trump and why it was resonating with a lot of his audience. The people were surprised to find out that was the case. Flu isn't something I think of as causing death because I'm 30 or even 40, 50. I might get a flu shot because I don't want to be sick, but it wasn't something that people often thought of as causing death, certainly not that many. And so for a while, it became a way to deflect the seriousness of COVID. And now on the numbers, that's out the window and you can't do it anymore. So they're trying it on a different front. And as it turns out, the numbers were never people standing there and putting tags on people and counting. So you should be aware of that. If you're going to compare the numbers when you are counting, as it seems to be the case with COVID, then you're not going to want to jump right into comparing it with an estimate. Right.
Now, another thing that Jeremy is doing is he's written a paper with another co-author looking at the excess deaths in New York City. Again, I'm trying to make the point that this is somebody who knows quite a bit about this topic. Okay?
Yeah.
And he's come up with the idea that the excess deaths in New York City are actually incredibly high, 21 times the number of deaths from seasonal influenza during the time period.
That sounds very high.
Okay. But it depends whether you're taking, what is your number for how many people died from flu? The lower you make it, the higher the excess deaths are going to be.
True, yeah.
Okay. And so that's why his whole point about how you measure flu deaths is important because it's going to change that number dramatically.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So he says the COVID-19 death toll as of April 27th was 55,000. Okay. That's a coronavirus raw number.
Right.
And so it's really difficult to compare to CDC numbers about flu because flu is modeled and the model may or may not be correct. So what he'd like to do is do a comparison of influenza deaths actually recorded. That's really difficult.
Yeah, because
okay. Well, what about all the people who are dying at home?
Right, true. People just say, I'm not going to the
right.
hospital.
What about people in nursing homes who have like 19 different existing conditions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's where the wingnuts come in and say people who are dying of COVID are on their last legs anyway.
Yeah, they're dying with it. They're not dying of
right,
it.
Yeah,
That's the excuse. If you look at raw data about
when they didn't have it, they were
how many
alive.
flu deaths, it's like counting the number of flu cases after we stop counting because we know it's there.
Yeah. I've not caught on to the wisdom of dying of it, with it, not of it thing.
Right. And again, he's
had all those
arguing
other
it from the
things.
point of view of COVID as being underappreciated.
Yes. Right.
But,
so that's,
but the lower you
that made it
make
easy
the
for
flu
me to
number,
accept.
the more you can make the case that it's being underappreciated.
Yeah. That's true.
So,
too.
so
I
it's
guess
interesting.
subject to
It's an interesting
manipulation.
approach, and I don't know that he's wrong. I don't know that he's right, but I do know that it's not fair to just say, well, CDC is massaging the numbers, which is what he comes flat out and says, and they're inflating the numbers for this, that, or the other reason. I don't think that's correct. And I've seen Lauren Simonson and some of the modelers at CDC argue about why their particular approach is perfectly okay, statistically valid, consistent with what they've done over the years, so on and so forth. And that argument is in the literature, and you can find it if you search for it. I mean, it's just I think it's a rabbit hole that you can go down. But what is the point of doing that? He's got very valid reasons. He's trying to statistically compare COVID to flu, so he wants a good number for flu so that he knows what he's comparing it to. That's why he's doing it, not to downplay it.
Well, no reason to downplay it that I can think of.
But in doing so, he winds up downplaying it.
Oh, well, sometimes an unfortunate.
Sometimes that happens.
Side
So
effect,
so that's
yes.
where that discussion goes.
All
But
right.
again, if you're going to compare it to flu, tell me which flu you're talking about.
That would help.
Seasonal flu, 1918 flu, Hong Kong flu in 68. I'm old enough to remember that one.
Yeah. Well, compared to any flu that had refrigerator trucks,
Yeah.
I don't see any.
Well, so again, the other thing is the way it's compressed. So I think that's important. So let's talk about some other stuff. I
All
think
right.
we did enough on that.
Statistical modeling, somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's talk about how Trump is doing with the
don't
polls on all of this, because
have
there's
to model.
new polling out this morning. For example, half of Americans financially affected by coronavirus. This is from NPR, which has some interesting things here in it that are beyond the headline. Trump does not fare very well as far as his handling of the pandemic goes. Most Americans, except Republicans, disapprove of the job he's doing.
It's a bad one.
This is a Marist poll, by the way.
Ah.
There are a few households in the country that haven't been affected by this crisis. And 80% or more of people who responded do not want schools, restaurants, or large sporting events to start taking place as normal again until there's further testing. And 2/3 don't want Americans to physically go back to work without that widespread testing, but a majority of Republicans do.
Sure, because
Okay.
reasons.
Trump gets a 44% approve, reflects his overall approval rating in past polls. His disapproval rating jumped 6 points from 49 to 55.
Okay.
So again, a lot of the approval is going to be soft because people feel like they should respect the office and hope that the presidency does better. We know that from Navigator polling, which is a different poll.
Right.
Okay. Now, the thing that jumped out at me, though, is that coronavirus could wind up being the major issue in the 2020 presidential election. According to the poll, 1/3 of people said coronavirus will either be a major, 14%, or minor, 20% issue. And 2/3 said they've already made up their minds.
Okay. That's
But if you have
Likely.
1/3
yeah.
of the voting population
Saying,
that is going to use coronavirus
how could you not?
as a feature,
Yeah.
I mean, I could tell you how you could not. I'm already not voting for him. I've already made up my mind.
Yeah. No. But yeah.
But if
how
a
could
third,
it not be
I mean, that's
considered
an
a major
enormously
issue?
large swing group.
Yeah. Now, even with me, I had made up my mind too. But you can be sure that if anybody asks, so why would you vote against President Trump? Well, I mean, coronavirus will be among my list, certainly.
Majority said they prefer Biden over Trump when it comes to handling both coronavirus, 55 to 40. And the economy, 51 to 44. Those are pretty big numbers.
And pretty big subjects.
And they describe that as, quote, what could be a difficult sign for Trump.
Yeah, those could become uncomfortable factors.
Right. Now, these are not head-to-heads necessarily, but they're head-to-heads on issues, or at least they're polling on issues. And I think the issues polling is always fascinating. This one is a different one from Morning Consult. Voters expect a second wave of coronavirus cases. Nearly 3 in 4 voters, 73%, think Americans should continue social distancing, even if it means continued damage to the U.S. economy. Just 15% say social distancing should end to boost the economy, even if the virus spreads. So voters are girding for a second wave of cases. 8 in 10 say second wave is very or somewhat likely. And the president's lowest marks are for developing a vaccine for coronavirus, with 36% rating his performance in this category as excellent or good. 36% selected excellent or good for testing. 36%. These are not high numbers.
No, and they're wrong.
In a forced choice, 65% of Republicans said the federal government should be responsible, while 23% said it should not be.
Yeah, that's a brand new idea.
And 84% of Democratic voters think the government should provide financial support, compared to 65% of Republicans and 72% of independents. And that's financially supporting state question. So the idea that Mitch McConnell should let the blue states just go bankrupt and Trump's off the hook on coronavirus because it's just like the flu, the polling does not support that. Let's just say.
All right. Well, it never made any sense, and I'm glad to see that lots of people across the board don't think so either.
And then finally, our Navigators survey tracking poll, day 26. In the early days of this tracking poll, Trump's coronavirus approval was 50% approve, 44% disapprove. Let me remember to actually give this to you so you can read along with us if I didn't already. Over the last week, it's been 44-53. So it went from 50-44 to 44-53. Where's it dropped?
Okay.
Independents, people of color, and older voters. This was yesterday. So let's look for today and see where we're at. And this is the most recent stuff, which is just an hour ago.
That is
Day 27 of the Navigator survey poll.
Okay.
All right. So I just wanted to give you that context because it's those older voters that are moving to Biden, and that's one of the reasons why Trump is having such bad poll numbers. We asked whether people are hearing mostly positive or negative things about Trump's handling of the crisis. The negative keeps ticking up, so we asked people to write what negative they've heard lately. They did one of those word cloud things.
Oh, yeah?
Remember the email one for Hillary?
I do. There was nothing else in it.
Word cloud presented without comment. The biggest one is disinfectant.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually pretty funny.
Yeah. Well,
okay. Also inject, also people.
Inject people, disinfectant.
Right?
Yeah,
so you have an idea of what kind of news they're hearing about. And, you know, I had this argument with some of my doctor friends. Why are we getting distracted by this typical shiny object of injecting people with disinfectant when there are more important things going on? And I'm shaking my head and saying, here's somebody who knows about medicine and nothing about politics.
I guess so. Why are people talking about
this is one of those things where I don't understand modeling curves and how many people really die of flu, but I do understand when he tells me to drink Clorox that that's not a good idea. It says so right on the bottle.
Well, yeah, minus, of course, the several who said the bottle's wrong.
Well, minus the number of people who actually did it, unfortunately.
Definitely minus them.
And that is a real number. It's not zero. It's a non-zero
number. Take them out of polls, too, by the way.
So here are the numbers on whether people have heard mostly positive or negative lately. This peaked at 48% in our most recent survey, which is mostly but not fully post-bleach.
Okay.
All right, 19% have read good things or heard good things, and 48% not.
Yeah. Well, there's so little to say that would be good.
Well, you know, he gives these press conferences, don't forget, which is what we're going to come back to and wrap up with.
They're bad.
Trump's ratings continue to slump, especially his healthcare approval rating, which is now 40 approve, 56 disapprove. His job as president is 44-55. Now, you think 44 is high, but that's a minus 11, 44-55. Right? He started out a minus 2.
Okay.
Minus 2, minus 7, minus 11 subsequent weeks.
Really should have been minus 11 back then, but all right.
Meanwhile, big state governors continue to earn. And remember, this is the poll. It's at 37% support him, and another 13% say they feel like they should support him.
Okay.
Meanwhile, big state governors continue to earn sky-high approval ratings, especially those who are taking the crisis seriously. All Democratic governors at 65 plus, with many higher on the GOP side The gap between DeWine and DeSantis and Kemp is notable given how they've acted.
Okay.
All right. So Mike DeWine, for example, his percentage approval is 85, and Kemp is at 51. DeSantis is at 51. Whitmer is at 65 in Michigan. Tom Wolf in Pennsylvania, 70. Pritzker in Illinois, 74. Newsom in California, 75. Cuomo, 80. Cuomo's been the most visible.
Yeah.
Cuomo made a lot of errors early on, but
yes.
Cuomo's been
Talked
the
about
most
them
visible.
yesterday.
And this is where the visibility of having a daily briefing helps you as opposed to Trump where it doesn't.
Yes. Say real things that are fact-based and normal, and you'll do better.
In general, we're seeing that Democrats are more trusted than Trump right now to respond to coronavirus, 48 to 41, a new high in our tracking. The president started this crisis with a 6-point lead.
Well,
Now evaporated.
What do you know? Yeah.
Right? Evaporated
Made a
like
great
an
deal.
open bottle of bleach. Top words people say applies to Trump's response: self-absorbed, unprepared, erratic, least likely to say honest, compassionate, and competent.
Well, because...
Right? Now, this is a big one, and I have to ask Nick because I don't know the number here.
All right.
Personal impact matters in a crisis. When we look at all 9,433 interviews so far, those who know somebody who has been infected are more likely to say they have serious concerns about Trump's early downplaying than those who do not. But I don't know the percentage of those who know someone. I can't tell that. They're 9 points more likely to say that Trump's early downplaying raises serious concerns.
Of course, that would...
Overall, 58 say have serious concerns about his downplaying it. But if you know somebody, that's 66. And if you don't know somebody, it's 57.
Right, and if you're the mailman or the neighbor, is the neighbor going to work? What's happening here? I don't even know. You're supposed to be staying home. I thought that was going to be gone.
Yeah, he's got an essential job, so he still goes.
Okay. Well,
He's one of the volunteers in our local ambulance service. So.
Okay. Well, Abby, you're just going to have to let him go.
So we're letting Abby go with him this time.
Okay. Sure.
So.
Good. That's fine. Yeah, she should take a ride. And
anyway, so the background for all of that is that, this is not working for Trump. The polls are pretty bad for Trump. If the election were held today, Trump would lose. There's 6 months left. We don't know what's going to happen. These are not predictive. But he's in a bad place.
Sure.
And he's in a bad place particularly because if you step back and look at the big picture, it's really hard to see how he's going to improve because things are going to get worse and not better, and the economy is going to get worse and not better, and the new job numbers should be out on Friday, right? Because it's Jobs Friday.
That's right. True. Yes.
We're talking about depression-level stuff here. So all of that is true. Mm-hmm. And just a reminder, all these polls are models.
Yes, right. True also, right? They don't interview every single person in the United States and ask them.
Right, so you can always have that, criticism of it if you wish.
We'll have Armando come on and criticize it that way. They didn't ask me. I'll tell you, they got it wrong.
Well, the poll that I'll be watching, in addition to all of this, of course, is the one in Michigan because Justin Amash is going to be running as a libertarian. And nobody cares. Or as G. Elliott Morris put it, to be fair, if you've already ruined your political career, what's stopping you from running for the Libertarian nod?
Yeah, I mean, it's a stepping stone to nowhere, of course, but
it is.
What the hell?
And these days, I'm just not afraid of it the way I was because the path for Trump victory is with a third party run by somebody strong. Yeah. And in the middle of a pandemic, this isn't that.
Right.
Okay. Final words before the break. The transcript of the president's response when he was asked if he's spoken with the families of anybody who has died in the pandemic is right here. Daniel Dale publishes it in full.
Yes.
It's awful, too long to read.
It's not an answer. Yeah.
But Olivia Nuzzi has a piece here. And remember, she is the person who asked about if a president should be reelected if he loses more Americans in 6 weeks than died in the entirety of the Vietnam War. That's one of those 6 weeks versus years.
Right.
Okay. And he took the question seriously, though, Trump being Trump, and he wandered off the topic to praise himself. He admitted a lot of people had died. As he spoke, there was something unusual about his face. He was sad and not angry, and then he took no more questions. She makes the case in this piece, not that we do away with fact-checking and reporting on context, that the supposed danger of first allowing the public to hear the president as the press assembled before the podium does is probably not much of a danger at all. Show Trump as he is, in all of his contradictions and incoherence. The American people can handle it. They just may not want to. And, he's not doing himself any good, so don't worry about the fact that he gets, quote, free airtime.
Okay.
It's free airtime that's shooting himself in the foot.
Yes, though that I'd like to have him have. All right, let's see. I don't see this one on the list here. Is that in the roundup or something?
Actually, I just came across it, so let me give it to you.
Oh, okay. I know you were talking about
it. Not in there. It should be in there. It's New York Magazine, Intelligence.
Oh, wait, no, there it is.
I'll get to it.
I do see it. There's no picture. I see, but I have found the link. But okay, now I have it twice. Yeah, that was interesting. Okay, well, right. And we'll read it once, so you don't have to read it at all. How about that? You've already read it though. It doesn't work for you, but as a model for most people, they won't have to do it. Okay, well that makes some sense. That was a weird question. Not a weird question, but an interesting exchange. And I'd like to now. I want to go see the video to see what was that look on his face.
Yes, very much worth doing. It would be at the end because he didn't take any questions after that. She says.
Okay, I did see the question you mentioned that Daniel Dale rounded up, where they asked him, "Have you spoken to any families of people who've lost people in it?" And basically, the answer is you have to glean from it is no. But it was real interesting to see him go on for a minute and a half about, you know what, Purdue University, such a fine university in a fine state. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing. He didn't want to say the answer, which was no, and then leave because that makes him look callous and detached. So instead, he talked about anything else, and basically that's what he did in yesterday's whatever he would call it. It wasn't really exactly a press conference, but...
well, here's the entire transcript of his answer, which is the second half of your show if you decided to read it.
Yeah, it's really not... It only took about a minute and a half, but it spoke volumes. We can at least say that. All right. Well, thanks very much, Greg. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your paying particular attention to the that one article, the blog entry at Scientific American. I think we all got a lot out of figuring out exactly what's behind it.
It's important to know where Jeremy's coming from because he's trying to make some good points there. And, we'll go over it again tomorrow if people have questions.
Sure, why not? We'll always have questions because lots of people were too lazy to understand it the first time. I don't know. Something like that. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it, and see you tomorrow. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Do you want to hear the transcript of what it was that the president said? I mean, we actually probably could just play the answer, but I think then we get into maybe some, who knows, whether we get our podcast taken off of YouTube for borrowing too much from somebody's broadcast. But I don't know. It was somewhat interesting, somewhat revealing. The question is, you've spoken about your friend who passed away. I was wondering if you have spoken to the families of anyone else who has lost a loved one to COVID-19. Is there any particular story, or if there's any particular stories that have affected you? And the president, in his way, answers in one paragraph, one or two rambling sentences, and the answer is no. But then so that's one paragraph. Then he does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more, which... you can see the tactic here, and it's not, it's not something that's exclusively done by him to change the subject, but the answer is no, and that makes him look detached and less than compassionate and out of touch with the American people, et cetera, et cetera. So what he does is blathers about some other stuff for a while until he feels like he's wormed his way out of it and distracted everybody with other ideas or other thoughts, and then basically then says, well, his other great trick, and lots of presidents use this one too, is that when he thinks he's done, rather than leave it open at that point for other questions or follow-ups, he scans the room and then picks somebody and jabs his finger at them and says, yes, go ahead, and goes immediately into, now if there's a follow-up question, the reporter who wants to ask it will be very rudely interrupting the other reporter whose turn it is. And that's how he avoids the follow-up question. So basically the question, have you spoken to anybody the families of anybody who's died from COVID-19? He says, well, I have. And so, I mean, the answer could be yes, but it's not enough people to be a good, solid yes. He's spoken, I think he had some people in, and there was a photo op of him sitting 6 feet away from one or two people who had family members die. And he spoke to him for a few minutes and said, that's very sad. And that was it. He hasn't been visiting hospitals or, condoling with hundreds of people. I mean, and you're supposed to be socially distancing, so maybe there's a good excuse. But so have you talked to anyone? Well, I have. I have many people. I know many stories. That's so far sounding like a no. I've spoken to 3, maybe I guess 4 families unrelated to me, and that could have been that photo op that I was telling you. But I think they did something in the cabinet room, and they sort of sat far away from him, and he said that's terrible. I did. I lost a very good friend. This is interesting too. I lost a very good friend. I also lost 3 other friends who I presumably are lousy. But he catches it and says, I lost 3 other friends, 2 of whom I didn't know as well, but they were friends and people I did business with, and probably almost everybody in the room did, which is also a true statement. And then he realizes, not really a good answer. You're done. You should have moved on to another question. And you can say probably everybody in the room did. And at which point a person with, normal feelings and normal reactions could say, I've been extraordinarily busy, obviously. And of course, visiting with the families of people visiting in this time of social distancing is not a real easy thing to do. And it hurts me that, people are out there suffering and I can't connect with them, but I really wish I could, but my role as president and the nature of the illness, etc., makes it very difficult to do that. I hope that at some point in the near future we can all take stock of this thing, emotionally and compassionately. And next question, that would have been fine, but he doesn't know how to do that because he doesn't feel that stuff. So how do you get out of that if you're the president? Well, okay, almost probably everybody in the room did. True. And it's a bad death. Yeah. It's a bad thing. It grips on to some people. And now he's like, what am I doing? I'm talking about the most morbid thoughts about it's so terrible. People suffer. Now we found out that young people do extraordinarily well. That's not exactly what we're finding. And by the way, more and more things being found out about the young people perhaps having extraordinarily bad long-term damage, and probably in some ways that we weren't anticipating. But anyway, that's not what he's saying. He says, that's why I think we can start to think about schools. And then he realizes, that's also sensitive. People don't want the schools open yet because we don't know what the hell's going on. And also, it's now late April. It's hardly any point in sending kids back to school. So now we found out the young people do extraordinarily well. That's why I think we can start thinking about schools. But of course, we're ending the school season. So, it wouldn't be probably you'd be back. You wouldn't be back for too long. Now I need my way. Where am I? I'm stuck in schools. How do I get out of this? I noticed we're Purdue University. This gives me a chance to waste more time with a great school and a great state. I love whatever state it is that Purdue is in. I think I actually know, but I'm not sure. And I don't want people to say that I'm stupid president if I guess it wrong. So it's in a great state, that state, which is so great. It has the school in it. He's now wasting time and using words to drag things out. I noticed we're Purdue University, a great school and a great state. Why are they in my head? They want to open and have students come in. Do they? I think that's correct. Now, by the way, I checked out about the Purdue thing, and I think the Purdue is one of the first schools to say, we're going to open in the fall as usual. Now, it's conditional, and they're going to have all sorts of changes made, but they were one of the first, I guess, to say that that's what they want to do. So they're not saying we want everybody to come back and finish the semester, but whatever. I noticed we're Purdue, great school, great state, wants to open and have students come in. I think that's correct. Some colleges, I think I saw Harvard, wants to have students come back in the fall. It's Purdue that you're talking about, but yeah, Harvard wants students to come back in the fall. They just haven't said whether they're gonna or not. I would hope that they'd have students. Yes, well, we all hope that. I think that the whole concept of computer learning is wonderful. He's wandering out of this now. This is my exit. But it's not the tele-learning. It is the tele-learning, but it's not the same as being in school. It is instead tele-learning. But it's not the same thing as being in a classroom in a great college. Or a college of any kind, once again. Also crappy colleges. I mean, it's very weird how he considers everybody. His mind really does wander, right? So it's not the same as being in the classroom at a great college or a college of any kind. College, university. There's nothing, you can't replace that. Coherent thought, right? So hopefully they're going to be coming back. Young people do very well with this horrible scourge. They do very well. He loves the drama of saying a horrible scourge. You're supposed, and it's interesting too that his big excuse of downplaying everything was, I want to give people hope. I want to give them good news. Horrible scourge. It grips onto people. What am I doing? What am I doing? Talk about kids. It's very weird. It's very interesting. There's more to it. They do very well. They don't. So I am going to see you tomorrow. I guess he's getting ready to leave. And we'll have other things to talk about, just like Mr. Rogers. We have a lot of interesting things. I don't think we should have a news conference today because this is a news conference. So again, I don't think we should have a news conference today because we're having a news conference today. Okay. In addition, it's a celebration of these incredible people that have done such a good job. And I think we found a couple of stars in this room today. I love talking about stars. I won't tell you who, but there are a couple. This guy right here is the biggest star in the room, right? And I don't know who he's talking about, but there's some applause, and I love that whole thing. How's that for a coherent thought? We found stars in the room today. I won't tell you who, but I'm telling you this guy is the next sentence. He's a star, but also not who. But they'll have students, and I hope they do, and I hope they don't. And some good colleges, and some bad colleges. Some people have it good, some people have it bad. Some good friends, some not so good friends. Anyway, it's time to wrap up. This guy right here, biggest star in the room, applause. We'll all agree that he's the I vote for you, okay? Great job you've done, and I really appreciate it. Something inaudible. I appreciate you being here. Couldn't have done better. And finally, I guess he's out of here. But the question, for those of you who forgot over the past 20 minutes, was have you spoken to any people who've lost family members in COVID-19? Nah, not really. Purdue, good colleges, some crappy colleges. I got good friends. I got some crap friends too. So kids do really well. Harvard, something, blah, blah, blah. It's not the same as not being in a class. Anyway, look, there were stars in the room today. I don't want to name names. I don't want to leave anybody out, but I'll do that. You know what? I voted for this guy. He's my biggest star. Anyway, time for us to go, everybody. Thank you very much for forgetting the question. And we're out of here. All right. I just thought that was an interesting, way of exiting some questions that are real, honest to God, softball questions. Although, there will be softball questions for a normal person, either because, of course, they visited with people who lost people to the pandemic, or, of course, they're adults. They can think on their feet and give an answer as to why that hasn't happened. Kate Sherrill pointing out, because she's there in Indiana, isn't that right? Anyway, Purdue, run by Mitch Daniels. And I saw he's the president of Purdue, and the name rang a bell. Yes, former Indiana governor who is a Republican, and so I guess that's what put him on the radar for Trump. And anyway, also speaking of people who are on the radar and Republicans running large institutions, states, for instance. Mike DeWine mentioned earlier. I guess he's wandering away from his so far pretty good, pretty solid science-based response to everything. I noticed that he made the news today in saying that he was going to be rescinding the guidance from the state that would make it mandatory for patrons returning to open businesses to be wearing masks when they go. You go shopping, you go in a store, got to be wearing a mask. Apparently he heard from his wife that, I don't know, maybe she's a big influence in his life. It's a legit thing. But his wife says that she's been hearing that some people, if they're told they have to wear a mask, are offended. And I am not sure what exactly that's supposed to mean or why I'm supposed to care that they're offended, but they are offended. They say they're offended, and it's in order not to offend them, we're going to say, well, we recommend that you wear a mask, but we're not going to make it mandatory. I don't know how the state exactly does go ahead and make it mandatory. I suppose there's a mechanism for it, but not without some more formal action. But I thought it was interesting that he bothered to say that we're going to change the guidance because some people might be offended. And of course, you know how anytime somebody finds out that some people might be offended, particularly if the Republicans might be offended, our mind immediately flips back to those people that showed up at one of the Trump rallies with the Trump F Your Feelings t-shirts, although it holds a particular resonance in this particular instance because the people that were pictured in that now iconic photograph are Ohioans, as it turns out. So actually constituents of Mike DeWine's, and we now find out, well, you won't all have to wear masks, even though that's going to be very helpful in suppressing a second wave or keeping the numbers down in a second wave. But you don't have to do it because you're offended by it. And not F your feelings, F everybody else's feelings. Yeah, those people were from the Cincinnati area, as it turns out, and still unashamed of what they did. And people have been speculating as to whether or not they've been showing up at any of the Reopen Ohio protests or not. And I guess we'll find out when when and if their obituaries show up in the newspaper. If they have a picture, it'll make it that much easier to identify them. Okay, so let's see. Do we have a number of people who've drank bleach in the last few weeks? Asks Ricky May from up in Canadaville, as you know. Do I have a number? I don't. Do you want one? 60. I don't really know what it is, but I have seen that there are reports in the paper of increased volume of calls to poison control centers I saw like 4 different states. I imagine it's probably every state had an increase. There was just either not interesting enough to report and I also don't know what that means. Like calling, I don't know. I mean, did they get a lot of calls where people said, I drank bleach, and they actually have to be treated, or are they getting calls from, people who are actually seriously considering it? Is that really true? Can you do that? Or are you getting crank calls that say, I'm thinking about drinking bleach, because people are bored, they're at home, they got nothing to do? I'm not really sure what's going on. But apparently there are a number of people, because there are enough people in the world that eventually, the most minuscule percentage is still going to produce a large raw number of people who did something dumb, like drank bleach. Maybe they drank it diluted. That's a thing that's going on. And then, I think there are also a lot of people who say, well, obviously you don't just take a bottle of bleach and drink from it. But it is possible to get away with drinking diluted bleach if you dilute it enough. Apparently, I guess some people think, well, that doesn't count somehow. And I maybe they're thinking, well, I know they use chlorine to clean up polluted water, to treat sewage, or to reprocess the water, or the water that you have in your tap has a certain amount of chlorine in it. So maybe that is the reason that they think that diluting it enough is a good idea. I don't know. I don't know what's driving them, but we don't have any actual numbers. So I guess we'll have to do statistical modeling on that one too. Let's see. Another comment here from Karen, who says, in my experience, we're talking about the flu counting and which doctors encounter and then count the numbers of flu cases they see. In my experience, mom of teens, pediatricians are testing for flu more often than in the past in order to rule it out. They both had different flus, as it turns out, the 2 teens, even with shots. So grumble, grumble. We're warned every year. Greg tells us every year, it's always a guess ahead of time as to what flus are we likely to see. They're modeling that too. What are we likely to see? You can't wait until you see what you see and then start making the vaccines. They won't be available in time if you do things that way. So you take a wild guess, combine some things, and do your best. All right. Let's see. Other items in the news. There's more COVID material, plenty of non-COVID material. Let me see what we have set aside in pocket. Greg has sent me more information, more writings from Jeremy Faust and what he's been up to. Let me just take a quick look at that too. He also apparently has been dissatisfied with the modeling on the R0 number for coronavirus and maybe everything else for that matter. So, he's looking for better tools to understand things his way. That's interesting. let's take a quick look. It looks like he excerpted something from one of his articles about this, saying, let's see, because of this, the currently accepted estimates of the basic reproduction number, the R naught, of the virus are inaccurate. He was arguing when? Back in, is this the article? Back in, there we are, end of March, 3/31/20. But I guess the argument is the R naught was inaccurate. It is unlikely that a pathogen can blanket the planet in 3 months with an R naught in the vicinity of 3, as reported in the literature. In this manuscript, we present a mathematical, he's got some co-conspirators here. We present a mathematical model taking into account asymptomatic carriers. So that was a good thought early on. Our results indicate that an initial value of the effective reproduction number could range from 5.5 to 25.4. Wow, with a point estimate of 15.4, assuming mean parameters. The first 3 weeks of the model exhibit exponential growth, which is in agreement with average case data collected from 13 countries with universal health care and robust communicable disease surveillance systems. The average rate of growth in the number of reported cases is 23.3% per day during this period. And I think he's got something to go on there, right? I guess when we really spent time talking about R naught and figuring out what it meant, understanding from Greg what it meant and how it was measured, the early days, I think they were talking about, what did they say? I can't recall what they were putting the number at, but it wasn't very, very high. I remember him saying measles being like R naught of 12, and this being maybe in the neighborhood of 3, as I recall. But the flu being much lower than that, and that this was more virulent, I guess, therefore, than the flu was going to be. But I guess they're arguing that, or maybe we didn't understand at that point, we weren't talking about asymptomatic carriage of the virus. And now that we know a little bit more about that and know that we're not capturing the people who stay away from treatment because they feel like they just have a bad cold, or maybe not even that, then if we're not counting those people, then we're not getting true numbers for R naught, I guess. If you're collecting the numbers of people who have it, and I guess we won't find that out until testing, but have no other symptoms, then, yeah, I think it makes sense to guess that the R naught number could be considerably higher. Let's see. Most of the ID folks I spoke to, Greg said, nah, 3 is enough. Okay, well, we could get their explanation perhaps tomorrow of why 3 covers it. Does 3 explain? I guess Jeremy's thought is, how did this thing get from Wuhan, China in late January to the entirety of the world? Everybody's got some of it in just a month or two, unless the R naught is higher. But I guess you can do it, especially in this age of modern travel. And I guess even accounting for asymptomaticity, you could still land on 3 and be okay, so long as those asymptomatic people make their way around the globe and do it quickly. I've noticed is, by the way, one of the things Trump likes to say about it being everywhere in the world is he keeps saying 184 countries are affected with this, and then saying, who even knew that there were 184 countries? Every time I look at the worldometer, it reminds me that there are 210 countries and territories around the world that are affected with this, and maybe the inclusion of territories is what's making the difference. But that is a minor point. I guess the major point, really, I guess we should be talking about is, yes, there are somewhere between 184 and 210 countries and territories affected with this thing. But now, as of today, 1/3 of all the cases in the entire world are in the United States. And probably more, although I guess we could boost the world numbers by finding out that there are more asymptomatic carriers are out there, or people who do have symptoms but haven't been tested yet because of the limitations. But the official numbers on, I guess, confirmed cases. Just over 3 million in the entire world, and just over 1 million of them, of course, being 1/3, are here in the United States. That's not a particularly good record. We haven't done all that well with this. Yes, one other point I wanted to make about this, a discussion I had about this online and a little bit offline as well, about South Korea being the gold standard. That phrase in particular piqued my interest because there was an exchange, maybe it was just yesterday, it could have been the day before, and one of the reporters, who usually does a pretty good job on these things, got in a tangle with Trump and Dr. Birx over the question of whether or not the United States had done more tests per capita than South Korea. And that was a particularly interesting moment because Trump pushed back and Birx agreed with Trump, saying, no, we've done more tests per capita than South Korea, which ordinarily isn't a very interesting thing to say, but is interesting in this context because in early days, South Korea was the one who tamped down on this thing and had the best record of response and had tested very, very broadly and was, if not leading the world in sheer numbers, then certainly it was the country that was doing the best in per capita testing that was a nation with a population of any real considerable size. And so it was then reported, the press in shorthand said, well, South Korea is the gold standard in testing. Now Trump seizes on that and says, well, why is South Korea the gold standard in testing? And again, in shorthand, without explaining the nuances, or without the nuances being properly picked up and digested and carried forward by the readers, perhaps, because sometimes it is in the article, sometimes not. It's the gold standard for a number of reasons, and we're leaving out one of the chief ones. But the Trump then gets a hold of the idea that they're the gold standard because per capita, and now we passed them per capita, and so therefore we are the gold standard. Well, a lot of things happening with that. One, South Korea maybe never was, but certainly no longer is. Not that they're not the gold standard. I think they still are, in a way, but they're no longer the country that has done the most testing per capita, and that's a weird measure because it throws in some things, some distortion at the extremes. For instance, if you actually sort over at Worldometer, who's done the most tests per capita? What they have is the measure of tests per 1 million in population, which ends up being more or less the same kind of calculation. So you can use that as a substitute for per capita, even though the number that you would report is different. But the tests per million makes more sense. And who's the world leader in that? Does it make any difference if I tell you it's the Faroe Islands? Now, we've had listeners in the Faroe Islands, and so welcome, everybody. That's really true. And it's a small population there, as it turns out. They've done 6,851 tests in total, and that's enough to make them the world leader in tests per million because there's very few people there. Now, a slightly more sizable country, but still small, but more legit, perhaps, in terms of talking about country. Faroe Islands are a dependent territory, too, so maybe that doesn't count. Iceland is next, so they're making a real play for it in the Arctic regions. Iceland has the second most tests per million. By the way, Faroe Islands figure for tests per million, 140,208 tests per 1 million population. But of course, they don't have anywhere near 1 million population. So that's how that number comes out. Iceland, which has about 300,000 population of 300,000, has done 139,411 tests per million. But in terms of raw numbers, 47,573 actual tests. Now, you want to talk about a combination of those two factors. The United Arab Emirates, slightly more populous, but has performed 1,122,000 actual total tests. So that's some real response that gives them the third highest rate in the world. Fourth highest rate in the world belongs to the Falkland Islands. You're getting a sense for what's going on here. Malta, Bahrain, San Marino, Gibraltar, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Lithuania, Kuwait, Estonia, Portugal, Israel, Isle of Man, Ireland, finally, something sizable, Denmark, then Qatar, the Channel Islands, Brunei, Norway, Italy, Spain, Switzerland. We're getting into real territory here. But per capita, we're still way behind. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday. But our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Edwards Radio. So you get the sense of what's going on here with what's happening by the per capita measure. The gold standard of South Korea, where do they come in this? What have we gone through, like 20 countries already? We stopped reading when we got into some of the European nations, Norway, Italy, Spain, Switzerland. Italy and Spain not really doing all that well. How are they doing in per capita testing? Better than the gold standard of... in the so-called gold standard of South Korea, or who's now been supplanted in Trump's mind, the gold standard being the United States. Who else is doing better than either of those two countries? Latvia, Austria, Bermuda, New Zealand, which recently came out and said, we've eliminated coronavirus in our country. I don't know that that's really actually the case. They're still listed as having 226 active cases, but... and added, right here it says new cases were added today, so +2, so I'm not so sure how they've done on that. But that's not what we're here to discuss. Who else has done more per capita testing than the gold standards of South Korea and the United States? Slovenia, Germany, we might have guessed that one. Liechtenstein, we see how that could happen. Russia, oh no, that could really damage Trump's ego. Czechia, which is, I guess, our new name for the Czech Republic, which they snuck by me. I think we may have actually mentioned that before, but I missed the announcement on that one. Andorra, another one of those micro countries. Australia, they're real. Greenland, which we might buy, which, by the way, is, I guess, the only place where they really have eliminated the virus in the, on the top half of this chart, that you get highlighted in green, which is very nice for Greenland, if you're working on no active cases. So congratulations to them. Interestingly, now we know why Trump wanted to buy Greenland. Greenland actually would have made him look smart. Remember, of course, we have 15 cases and soon it'll be down to 0. Greenland had 11 and it's down to 0. So he meant Greenland, our new territory, newly acquired, wholly owned subsidiary of Greenland. Well, see, that's why he was telling the truth. Who else has done better than us? Of course, Singapore, Canada, congratulations, Belgium, where they are now encouraging residents to eat fries twice a week to eat up the potato surplus. Not French fries, they're Belgian. You understand. Everyone was very excited about that and thought we ought to do the same thing here in the United States. I do remind you that they eat them with mayonnaise. And I don't know if you want to back off of your recommendation now. Hong Kong, better than us. But only barely, because we're next with the figure of 17,960 tests per 1 million population. Okay. by number of tests performed, period, I believe we are at the top of that list. 5,944,764. That number, which is better than zero, still has us behind, well, among others, Liechtenstein, the Faroe Islands, etc., but also some major players out there. And guess what, though? We are, per capita, better than South Korea. How much better? Well, next up is Belarus, Cayman Islands. We've managed to pass them. That's good news. Finland, New Caledonia, Venezuela, Aruba, Slovakia, Azerbaijan, Bhutan, Djibouti, Netherlands, Kazakhstan, South Korea, with 11,980 tests per million of population. So, have we crushed the gold standard is the question here. Well, it was never a good label, for one thing. What made South Korea the gold standard if they're now worse than Kazakhstan? God damn it. And the answer is that one element that all the denialists seem to be leaving out of everything: time. Time and reaction speed and total time to get up to speed with your testing. What made South Korea the gold standard is they tested so widely and so quickly and traced contacts so efficiently that the real number you ought to be measuring here, which is deaths per 1 million in population, is extraordinarily low. The number of tests per 1 million in population, very nice, almost 12,000. How many deaths per million? 5. How many deaths per million in the United States? Now, currently, 179 deaths per million. So on that, on an even playing field, 5 for South Korea, 179 for the United States, even though we've surpassed them in our test rate per capita. Now, that was news, I think, to the reporter who actually asked the question. He was working off of old information, which was true for the vast majority of the time we've spent in this pandemic. South Korea has been ahead of us in testing per capita. As it turns out, it was sometime last week that the United States finally surpassed the testing per capita rate of the South Koreans. But the reason it was the gold standard was because of how widespread its testing was and how quickly that testing got done, and therefore the result was 5 deaths per million in population. The United States finally surpassed the per capita testing rate, but they did it 2 months into the pandemic. The time makes a difference. When you're talking about exponential growth of something over time, time makes a big difference. The earlier you act on these things, the better your outcome. We were way slow, but through the functioning of our traditional media, social media, our impatience at reading headlines and taking away bullet points as opposed to getting a wider understanding of what's actually going on and why something would be a gold standard. Why is South Korea the gold standard? Because they were effective in preventing deaths. How did they become effective in preventing deaths? Testing per capita very quickly. Testing per capita, we can do that. We've now tested more people per capita, but it's too late. I think I happened to see someone starting another analogy, and I never saw exactly how they finished it, but I would finish it this way. 2 houses on fire, responded to by different fire companies, right? Firehouse 1 responds to this one, Firehouse 2 responds to the other. Firehouse 1 shows up, and the upper floors of the house are on fire, and they respond immediately, and they're there within 5 minutes of getting the call, and they put the fire out, and, relatively successful. I mean, large portion of the house is damaged, lots of losses to be sure. Maybe they saved everyone who was in the structure. And we used, I don't know what's a real measure of how many gallons of water you would use in putting out a house fire. We used 10,000 gallons of water to put out this house fire. Now, down the street or around the corner or in the next town over, or a fire company 2 got the call on house fire number 2, they said, we're going to wait a couple hours before we go there. And when we get there, this house is perhaps still on fire. Maybe it's smoldering, but 3 houses around it are now on fire. At any rate, they wait until much later, and they then compare results afterwards. Now, house 2 is a total loss because they waited 2 hours to show up. But the fire was raging so out of control that they used 100,000 gallons of water to put it out. Well, per capita, we've done more. Look at our number is so much bigger, 100,000 gallons. Well, that doesn't seem like a good measure of anything. Oh, yeah? What puts out fires? Water, right? So if the problem is fire, the greater response is the better response. 100,000 gallons, that's 10 times the amount the losers down the street used to save half a house, right? Now, you just can't measure things this way. And, part of the problem there was, of course, working with outdated information, but outdated information of 2 kinds. Not only that we had surpassed the South Koreans in per capita testing, but that per capita testing was not really the metric you ought to be worried about. And yet it was so easy to understand. Gold standard. How do you vary from the gold? You don't. Well, lots of countries doing a lot better than both of us in per capita testing. Sometimes it makes a difference, sometimes it doesn't. It did lead me to another question, though, about how Sweden is doing. That has come up in the past on the show because they're taking this more, as they say, a more relaxed approach to things. Something I noticed about Sweden's numbers, not great, quite honestly, but not as disastrous, I suppose, as we might have thought. And I'm sure there are lots of reasons for it, but not as disastrous as we might have thought, given that they weren't, taking it as seriously as we thought they ought to and having more strict lockdown. But a lot of things factoring into it, including one stat I read somewhere that Sweden already had the highest percentage of their people working at home anyway, so that social distancing in the workplace wasn't quite such a stretch and didn't damage their economy quite as much as it's damaged ours. But still, all in all, compared to their neighbors, Norway and Finland, they're not doing all that hot in terms of keeping the number of cases down. But another weird thing that I noticed, let's see, so Sweden has 20,302 cases and has experienced 2,462 deaths. Not great. Finland has a much lower rate, 4,906 cases, 206 deaths. And Norway, too, I think, has had a much lower rate. Where do I find them in this chart? I'm going to have to reconfigure the chart. But they, too, I think, far fewer than 10,000 cases. And I think maybe even fewer than 5,000 if I look at it. Where's Norway? I have to go to the alphabetical listing in this chart. Almost there. Okay. 7,660 cases with 206 deaths. Again, Sweden with a much more inflated 20,000 cases and almost 2,500 dead. But not the utter disaster that many people predicted. What I did find interesting was Sweden, if you look in them, the details of each country, you can see how they're doing, how many cases they've got, and how many active cases they have, how many are recovered, how many, etc. So Sweden, what I found interesting was 20,000 cases, 1,000 total recoveries, 2,500 total deaths. So for the cases that have resolved themselves one way or another, they are running 70% of their case resolutions are deaths, whereas 30% of their case resolutions are recoveries. And that's the absolute reverse of just about every other country in the world. I don't know if there's another country out there with more people who have died than have recovered. That's an extraordinarily strange result, and I don't know whether the data got entered backwards for Sweden, but nobody else, like it's a typo in the coding of the chart, or whether it's really happening that way, but I've seen it from more than one source. But, maybe they're all drawing from the same place. But that would be a weird reversal and maybe something that they want to evaluate going forward. I just thought I'd put that one out there for people to monitor. Let's see. Oh, my tab just crashed. And which tab is that? It's Pocket. So that's not so great. Let's see. Well, I can't really think about whether or not I'm going to report that or not now, but let's restore the tab. Lots to jump in on. Some non-COVID related stories that probably deserve some attention. For instance, making the news and reported here by CNN and a number of other outlets as well. Action in the Roger Stone cases. The Mueller investigators said Roger Stone orchestrated hundreds of fake Facebook accounts in his political influence scheme. This as a result of the release of Justice Department and Mueller investigations materials on Stone. I guess the news media were looking to get released in public the search warrants that were issued for Stone's house and office and everything, and the underlying basis for the searches and some other materials. So I guess we're getting a better picture confirmed now of exactly what it was Roger Stone was up to and all this. He, of course, still maintains that all of it was perfectly reasonable and legal, and he's being persecuted for political purposes somehow by the regime of the president he helped get selected, if not elected. But I don't know. That's neither here nor there. But this is what we learned. Investigators from former special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation told a judge that Trump political advisor Roger Stone orchestrated hundreds of fake Facebook accounts and bloggers to run a political influence scheme on social media in 2016, according to court documents from the Mueller investigation unsealed on Tuesday. The disclosure came as the Justice Department on Tuesday made public dozens of search warrants from its investigation into Stone after CNN and other news organizations sued for access to the files. Stone's assistant, interviewed voluntarily by former special counsel Robert Mueller's investigators, said that as part of his work for Stone, he bought a couple hundred fake Facebook accounts, and that bloggers working for Stone sought to build what looked like real Facebook accounts to push information about the 2016 Russian hack of the Democrats, a search warrant unsealed on Tuesday stated. And I think we had surmised that he was doing this, but now we have it, I guess, established by the filings for the search warrants. In 2016, Stone had wanted to push WikiLeaks content online that could help then-candidate Donald Trump, including content from stolen emails from accounts belonging to John Podesta, then campaign chairman of Trump's rival, Hillary Clinton, the warrant alleged. The warrant that mentioned the fake accounts sought data from Facebook for 3 accounts, 2 of which were registered to the handle Roger Stone. So not very well hidden, I guess, and all that. At least one of the suspected Stone accounts was used from October 2016 to March of 2017 to buy advertisements to push stories related to Russia and WikiLeaks, according to the warrant. Some social media messages from the accounts rebutted that the Russians were behind the online pseudonym Guccifer 2.0, which the U.S. intelligence community has said was, in fact, operated by Russian intelligence to disseminate hacked materials aimed at damaging Clinton's campaign. So anyway, there's more to the story, and I don't think we will read it all aloud here, but perhaps more interesting nuggets will be distilled out from this news story. So those were released yesterday, important to note, and we'll keep an eye on that. Other courtroom developments, there were arguments en banc before the D.C. circuit yesterday that were very interesting, and I know Armando had an eye on those, and he was watching through Zoe Tillman, senior reporter for BuzzFeed News, who was watching on TV now that everything is socially distanced. We finally get live television coverage of courtroom proceedings, including when they have their hearings or oral arguments, the Supreme Court, which is something, we've been told couldn't happen for so many years, and then coronavirus, and now it can. So poof. Anyway, she covered the entirety of the hearings there. I noticed it only came to my attention when I saw Armando commenting on some of these things, but this would be in the Don McGahn subpoena case, which meant that there were Justice Department lawyers arguing before arguably the second highest court in the D.C. Circuit Court, rehearing the case en banc, standing there telling them that there is no congressional right to enforce subpoenas against anybody in the executive branch for any reason ever. They were arguing for the absolute immunity approach to things. And apparently at some point they were asked by Merrick Garland, as it happens, whether or not their position really actually meant, for instance, if the president were to decide unilaterally, let's say, that universal health care was something that he really wanted and thought was important in this country, couldn't get Congress to pass it, Republicans in Congress refused, hell, Democrats in Congress refused. But if the president were simply to say, yeah, from now on, the federal government is going to pay for everybody's health care, period. That's just the way we're going to do it. Everybody else does it. Now we're going to do it too, starting now. And people say, well, that's unconstitutional. Congress has to pass that law. You can't just do that by executive order. And the president says, well, tough, I'm doing it anyway. The argument that the government was putting forward yesterday, in part, about, one, there being absolute immunity from subpoenas from Congress, they were, in addition to saying that there was such immunity, that it wasn't even allowable for the D.C. Circuit Court or any federal court to intervene and try and figure out whether or not absolute immunity was a real thing. This was a non-justiciable political question, and the courts should be prohibited from taking any role in reaching a decision on whether or not there is such a thing as absolute immunity in the first place. And Merrick Garland was asking, well, if political questions are just non-justiciable, period, no matter what, and I mean, that's been the position of the courts. When they conclude that this is a political question, they have declined to rule on it and called it non-justiciable. They, to date, have not appeared to agree, except for the 2-1 decision that's being reviewed here en banc. To date, no other court has ever agreed that, it's not even something you can bring up in court. And there really is this idea of absolute immunity. And it's so absolute that you can't even litigate it. Merrick Garland found himself asking the Justice Department, well, if the president were to just simply decide on his own to insure everybody and to pay for everybody's health care, are you telling me that Congress couldn't sue and say that's not the role of the president? This is the prerogative of the legislative branch. And, well, the DOJ was forced for the moment anyway to say, yeah, that actually, I guess, is our position. But don't worry too much about it, because they're gimmitarians, and if they need to sue to stop a Democratic president later on, they absolutely will. Anyway, we'll perhaps get to digesting the proceedings before the D.C. Circuit later on in the week. Maybe that's a Good Friday thing to do when we have a full 2 hours ahead of us. I also made mention of the idea of the president's executive order on opening up or keeping the meat packing plants open. Maybe that didn't amount to everything that he promised. I saw Charlie Savage make mention of it. I saw Steve Vladeck make mention of it. They seem to be on the same page as they often are. Charlie Savage saying, I don't immediately see how Trump's executive order, essentially deeming meat essential to the national defense, which it may be, results in forcing meat plants to stay open involuntarily. Remember, Trump has a history of signing empty executive orders, creating the illusion of action to get headlines. And then, actually, right after that, he says, Charlie Savage does, that, hey, Steve Vladeck has already broken it down. I have that one saved here, too. Steve put it this way. I don't mean to cause trouble, but I think these headlines are getting it wrong. Imagine that. Gold standard and whatnot. Nothing in the text of the order claims any power to force plants to stay open, and nothing in the statutory sections on which the order purports to rely, very good, delegates such authority. Here's why, he says, and he explains why, but he's reacting to Yamiche Alcindor's tweet saying, it's official, he's signed the executive order, and so that's that. Looking further into it, Steve continues, the order's big move is to designate meat and poultry as strategic materials under the Defense Production Act. Fair enough, but all it authorizes is for the Secretary of Agriculture to use his authority under the Defense Production Act. That is Section 101 of the DPA. But the DPA Section 101 says nothing about forced openings. Instead, the Defense Production Act Section 101, which you can find at 50 U.S. Code Section 5411 if you happen to have the annotated code available to you. Well, it's just about allocation of federal resources and priority for federal contracts. There's no authority under this provision to force private businesses to do anything other than prioritize federal contracts. To be sure, the order also delegates to the Secretary the authority to implement the more coercive provisions in Chapter 3 of the Defense Production Act, but the order does not direct the Secretary to do so, and none of those provisions include compelled openings either. All of this is to say that once again, we're buying into how the White House is describing the president's actions rather than carefully parsing the actions themselves. Always read the paperwork, right? Putting aside the sensational and alarming headlines, this executive order actually seems fairly uncontroversial. It's uncontroversial because it does nothing. There is a link to the executive order provided, a screenshot of the executive order provided, and that's it. Yeah, I mean, you can read it. It's titled Executive Order on Delegating Authority under the DPA with respect to food supply chain resources during the national emergency caused by the outbreak of COVID-19, which basically I think is a pretty good hint in the length of that headline, the length of the title, that they're fudging things here. And I guess the really interesting stuff is in Section 2 of the order here, and I guess it's not the entirety. Oh, yes, it is. It's only a 3-page order. Section 2, like we said, basically authorizes the Secretary of Agriculture to say, well, we ought to do some things, if he decides that we want to do some things. And some of those things that he can do don't reach to the level of forcing a private business to stay open or to keep producing. They simply have to prioritize federal contracts, which they can do by saying, you're top of the list when we open again, but that's all we've got. So I think that's important. It proves one of or continues to add fodder for one of our continuing themes, which is don't take the president's word for it when he says, I've done a very powerful, very strong executive order. Read it first. I know that's boring. But you'll find out in most cases that he's, talking out of his hat, let's say, and all this. All right. Things we didn't get to today that perhaps other fantastic shows that happen to follow this one, the best shows on Netroots Radio, follow this one. But that's because we're first in the day, of course. But anyway, the point is there's much more to cover. We'll come back next week. And whether or not Justice covers these other stories which are hanging out there, tantalizingly enough, a Vanity Fair piece. Is this our favorite? Yes, Gabriel Sherman, continuing on the Trump analysis beat with the very temptingly titled Inside Donald Trump and Jared Kushner's 2 months of magical thinking. So that sounds like a very interesting and promising place to look tomorrow. Let's see. Of course, more analysis of the early and initial inaction in the Trump administration and why coronavirus spreads so rapidly and continues to spread so rapidly in the United States, because of their ignoring every attempt at advising them that something serious was happening. We learned over the weekend and on Monday morning about how many times the now infamous presidential daily briefings, the PDBs, were ignored by President Trump, telling him that he had a problem on his hands and he really needed to do something, and that time was of the essence. Again, time becoming the gold standard, an important part of all of this. And again, second Republican president in a row, by the way, who has created major historical world-changing disasters in the United States by sleeping on the PDBs. Just want to point that out. This is a Republican habit, and they're electing lazy people. No drama Obama read those things, took those briefings. There were problems, but nothing like this. Could it have anything to do with their abiding interest in taking things seriously and actually governing Democrats? Maybe. Could be coincidence, though.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, Justice Putnam picks things up with the West Coast Cook Book and Speakeasy next, though, the major story of Trump's neglect of veterans. But remember, I gave them choice. No other president would do it. Well, nearly 70 aging Massachusetts veterans sickened with the coronavirus and have died in a long-term care facility there in Massachusetts. A real tragedy.